Hello my angels, and welcome back to part 2 of this tutorial where I am going to teach you how to create crispy, clean, hybrid brow sculpts for your client. Now if you haven't already, go back and watch part 1 as I showed you how to perfectly map out your client's brows for symmetry. Plus I showed you a few little techniques to speed up the process so that you are not wasting valuable appointment time, but you can also see here, speed it up, I am doing the mapping again for you so you guys can have a little idea of what you missed out on. Okay, now let's get into it. So after you have finished mapping out the client's brows, you're happy with how they're looking and the client is also happy with how they're looking, go ahead and remove any excess chalk. If they're on the brow hairs, it needs to come off before you apply the dye. I personally, as well as you can see, like to remove all of the extra lines. I do not need them anymore now that I know that the brows are symmetrical. So the less lines, the less confusion, the better it is personally for me. Before we go ahead and apply the brow dye, the first thing we are going to do is trim the brows. So brush the brows upwards, keeping them in their natural shape, but upwards. Pull the skin nice and tight, and you can see that I am just trimming any brow hairs that sit above the mapping lines. It's really important that you take your time with this, and remember, sometimes less is more. You can always go ahead and trim the brow hairs more if you need to, but you can't replace hair that you have trimmed off if you accidentally took off too much. Okay, the next thing I am going to do is go ahead and mix up the dye for the application. I am using Bronson for this application. Honestly, Bronson is my all-time fave. I don't think I'll ever use anything else. So I am using dark brown and chestnut. I am using 95% dark brown, 5% chestnut. Now I have mixed it together and picked up such a small amount. You can see that what I do when I pick it up is I coat both sides of the brush and tap off the excess. You do not want to use too much dye when you apply it, otherwise that will cause an uneven, patchy looking stain. So pull the skin nice and tight, and what we are going to do is start carving out that underline of the brow. This is the step that honestly makes or breaks a hybrid brow sculpt. If you've ever done a hybrid brow sculpt and you felt like it hasn't looked crispy and defined, it's probably because you didn't create enough depth and definition on this underline. So go ahead and pick up small amounts of the product and stamp it in. Do not swipe, stamp it underneath the brows. If you make a mess or you aren't happy with how sharp the lines are looking, with a small micro brush, go in and just clean up those lines as you go. The more experienced you get, the less you'll have to do that, but I still to this day like to do that for that extra bit of reassurance. Also make sure that you start at the back end of the brow, so towards the tail, and you make your way towards the front like I am here. Once you have completed that first underline, go ahead with your micro brush, clean up those lines if you need to, and then we are going to repeat the same step. As I said, this underline needs to have a lot of depth and a lot of definition to it, so we are actually going to carve out this underline 3 times before we go ahead and apply dye to any other part of the brow. Now the third time that you complete the underline, what I want you to do after that is go ahead with a damp cotton tip and gently wipe off the fronts of the brow on a 45-degree angle. This is going to help create that ombre look. Now we are going to carve out the arch. Again, we are going to start towards the tail or the back end of the brow because we want that to be a more bold, fuller stain, and we want the front to be light and airy and give that ombre effect. Again, you can see I am not swiping the product at all. I'm always stamping in small amounts of the product, and I'm going through the middle of the brow now to make sure that there is no patchiness or unevenness. If you accidentally go outside of your mapping lines with your micro brush, just go ahead and give them a wipe. Once you get to the front of the brow again and you have carved out the whole brow with a dry cotton tip, just wipe off the fronts of the brow again on a 45-degree angle, and we are just wiping off literally just the fronts of them, just going to help create that ombre effect. And in about 30 to 60 seconds, we will wipe off the front again with a wet cotton tip. Okay, now I feel like I have been yapping a lot throughout this tutorial so far. So now that we have done the first brow and I have cleaned up all of my lines, I am actually going to stay quiet so that you guys can concentrate and watch me complete the other brow. Okay, hopefully I have now been quiet long enough for you so that you can just soak in all of the visuals and pick up any tips or tricks along the way that you may see me do. Now, in part 3 next week, we will be going over how to remove the dye, how long we leave the dye on for, how to wax the brows, and how to make sure we get rid of any stubborn hairs for those crispy, clean lines, and the final steps before our hybrid brow sculpt is complete. If you haven't already, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button on this, and I can't wait to show you what's in store next week.